She pulled 16 bullets out of a dying stranger in a back room at midnight. No gloves that fit, no proper anesthesia, no one else in the room. Just her hands, a portable lamp, and 11 years of training she had never expected to use like this. The man on her table did not make a sound. Not once. Not through any of the 16. He just looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly, deliberately, like a person who had decided in advance that pain was simply information, and information did not require a reaction. She had treated soldiers who made more noise. She had treated accident victims who begged. This man said two things the entire night. The first was, "I don't know how many." The second was, "Someone who owes you something significant." She did not know his name. She did not know that half of Detroit's industrial network answered to him. She did not know that the water pitcher on his desk was being used to slowly take years off his life. She did not know that the man she was saving had been betrayed by the one person he had never thought to question, the man who had been at his side for 20 years. Placing that pitcher on his desk every single morning, she just knew he was dying, and she knew how to stop that. What she did not know was what came after. Some people are born to rule, and some lessons, the ones about loyalty, about power, about who you can actually trust when everything is on the line, those lessons are never taught in any classroom. Only the people who have lived at the edge of real power know them. This channel does not tell stories about crime. This channel tells stories about mindset, about character, and about the secrets behind what real power actually looks like from the inside. Here's what this story will teach you. It will teach you that the most dangerous person in your life is never the enemy you can see. It is the person you have stopped questioning because they have been present for so long that their presence feels like furniture. It will teach you that real strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the decision about who is in the room when you are vulnerable. And it will teach you that the moment you stop asking why someone is loyal to you is the moment you have handed them everything they need to take from you. Marcus Vail controlled an entire city and never saw the one thing that was right in front of him every morning for 20 years. That is not a story about weakness. That is a story about the specific blind spot that power creates and how to see past it before it costs you everything. If this is the kind of story that makes you think, stay with us, like this video, so more people find it. Leave a comment and tell us which moment hit you hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that the best lessons come from the most unlikely places, subscribe, because we are just getting started.
There are nights in Detroit that feel like the city is holding its breath. No wind, no rain. Just that particular stillness that settles over industrial neighborhoods after midnight, when the factory shifts have ended and the streets belong to nobody in particular. Sonia Cross had worked through enough of those nights to stop noticing them. After 11 years as a registered nurse, the city's moods had become background noise, something she registered, the way you register the hum of a refrigerator. Present, unremarkable, easy to forget. It was 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday when everything changed. She was walking to her car, that was all. 12 hours on her feet, two difficult patients, one family she had to deliver bad news to in the hallway because there was no private room available, the usual. She was thinking about the student loan payment due on Friday, $47,000, a number she knew, the way she knew her own heartbeat, and whether she had enough in checking to cover it without touching the small emergency fund she had been building for 2 years. The rear parking lot of St. Anselm Community Clinic was poorly lit. One of the overhead bulbs had burned out 3 weeks ago, and nobody had replaced it. She parked back here anyway because the closer lot cost $4 a day, and she had learned, over years of careful living, that you do not spend money on convenience when you are paying down $47,000. She heard the sound before she saw anything. Not a gunshot. That had happened somewhere else, earlier, and she was not there for it. What she heard was the sound of a person falling. A specific sound, heavy and uncontrolled, the kind that comes from a body that has lost the ability to manage itself. After 11 years in clinical settings, she knew the difference between someone tripping and someone going down. She moved toward it before the thinking part of her brain got a vote. This is important to understand about Sonia Cross. She was not a hero. She did not think of herself as brave. She was someone who had been trained, over thousands of hours, to respond to other people's pain faster than her own self-preservation reflex. By the time she was 35, that was not a choice anymore. It was just how she was built. The man was leaning against the wall behind the dumpster at the far end of the lot. Black suit, soaked through with blood, more blood than she had ever seen from a person who was still conscious. His eyes were open. He was looking directly at her. She did not ask his name. She did not ask what happened. She crouched down and said, "How many?" He looked at her the way someone looks when you're deciding, in real time, whether to trust a stranger. "How many what?" he said. "Entry wounds. How many?" A pause. Then, "I don't know." "Okay," she said. "I'm going to find out." There was a black car parked at the far edge of the lot. Lights off. Engine running. She registered it in the same second she registered everything else. Calling 911 in this situation meant police. Police meant questions. And the man in front of her, with the suit that cost more than her monthly take-home, and the way he was watching that car, he would be dead before he answered the first question. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Not far." "You don't have to go far. You just have to get inside." Two men materialized from the shadows near the black car. She did not ask who they were. She told them where to go. They carried him through the side entrance of the clinic, past the storage corridor, into the back procedure room that the clinic used for minor surgical interventions. Earl, the night security guard, was asleep at the front desk. She let him sleep. She closed the door, turned to the two men. "Out," she said. One of them started to speak. "He needs room." "You're taking up room." "Out." The man on the table looked at them. Something passed between them, a look, nothing more. They left. Sonia pulled the portable surgical lamp from the corner, checked her supply cabinet. Local anesthetic, forceps, suture materials, sterile gauze, not a surgical suite, not even close. But she had been working in under-resourced settings long enough to know the difference between what was ideal and what was possible, and to work with what was possible without wasting time mourning the gap. She counted the wounds, entry points only, moving systematically. When she reached the final count, she sat back on her heels for exactly 3 seconds. Then she got to work. 16. She had never worked on a living, conscious person with 16 gunshot wounds. She had assisted in trauma settings with patients in worse shape on paper, but those patients had full surgical teams, proper anesthesia, monitoring equipment. She had none of that. She had a lamp, a cabinet, and 11 years of training. "This is going to hurt," she told him. Not an apology. An apology would have been pointless.
"I'm aware," he said.
"Move. Even when it's very bad, don't move." Understood. He did not move. Not once. When the pain was at its worst, and she knew exactly when that was, because she knew what she was doing to him, he closed his eyes and breathed, slowly and deliberately, like someone who had decided in advance that making noise would serve no purpose. She had never seen anything like it. Patients screamed. Even trained ones flinched. This man simply breathed. The 9th bullet was the hardest. It had lodged near the lower right ribs, deeper than the others, in a position where the local anesthetic could not fully reach. She told him. "How long?" he asked. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. "Then let's not talk about it." She worked. He breathed. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, the bullet was on the tray. When the 16th was done, she stepped back, washed her hands at the small sink. Looked at the tray, 16 small pieces of metal in a row under the yellow light of the lamp. Evidence of something she did not want to understand too clearly. He turned his head and looked at her. For the first time in nearly 2 hours, he was looking at her as a person. "You didn't ask," he said. She knew what he meant. It wouldn't have changed what needed to be done. Who are you? The person who just removed 16 bullets from your body. Who are you? He didn't answer right away. Someone who owes you something significant. You owe me nothing, she said. You owe yourself better judgment about where you walk at night. For just a moment, she would think about this later. In the car, on the way home, something moved across his face. Not amusement, not politeness. Something more like Shinjin's surprise, the expression of a person who had not been spoken to that way in a very long time. His men came back in. They had a car ready. Within 15 minutes, the room was empty. Sonia cleaned up alone. When the tray was clear, she prepared to drop the bullets into the medical waste bag. Then she stopped, took one bullet out, looked at it under the lamp. Not standard. She was not an expert in ammunition, but she had seen enough standard rounds in emergency settings to know this was different. She put it in her coat pocket. Earl appeared in the doorway, blinking. Everything okay back here? Thought I heard something. Inventory check, she said. Nothing exciting. She drove home through empty Detroit streets, parked. Sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. She would file this night away, she decided. People came through her clinic in crisis and left, and that was the nature of the work. This was no different. She believed that for about 3 days. The clinic debt had been sitting at $340,000 for 14 months. It was the first thing the director in staff meetings, and the last thing he thought about before sleeping. Riverside Capital had purchased the debt from the original lender 8 months ago, and since then, the tone of the conversations had shifted. Less like negotiation, more like countdown. Sonia knew the number. Everyone at St. Anselm knew the number. It was the reason the supply cabinet in her procedure room had gaps, the reason 2 of the exam rooms were out of commission, the reason Earl was the only overnight security guard for a clinic that served 400 patients a week. 3 days after the night with the 16 bullets, she was finishing a day shift when she noticed a man standing outside the clinic entrance. Not a patient, not a delivery person. Standing, watching, then gone. She logged it the way she logged everything: time, description, direction of departure. She did not know why she was logging it. She logged it anyway. That evening, at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, she opened her laptop. She searched for news coverage of a shooting in Detroit that Tuesday night. Nothing. A 16-bullet incident with no police report meant everyone involved wanted it kept quiet, which meant the man she had treated was not a random victim. Random victims called for ambulances. Random victims had families who called police. This man had 2 guards who carried him in silence and a black car with its engine running. She closed the laptop. Looked at the bullet on the table. She had taken it out of her coat pocket when she got home and left it there, which told her something about her state of mind that she chose not to examine too closely. This was not her problem. She believed that for 4 more days. On the 7th day after that night, she walked out to the rear parking lot after a late shift and found an envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Inside, a plain card with a phone number and a handwritten note on a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was even and deliberate, the kind that belongs to someone who writes with intention and does not rush. The note read, "You kept my confidence. I would like to return the courtesy. The clinic's outstanding debt to Riverside Capital is being resolved. You will not receive formal notice for approximately 2 weeks. I wanted you to know in advance. V's." She stood in the parking lot and read it twice. Then she got into her car and sat for a while. MV. The clinic's debt. Being resolved. No request in return. No threat. No ask. This was, she understood, how power communicated when it was not trying to intimidate. He was telling her, knew where she worked, knew about the debt, knew her schedule, and the way he was telling her was not a warning. It was, by some completely different standard, a courtesy. She put the card with the phone number in her wallet, did not call. Not yet. Good nurses did not act on incomplete information. On the 9th day after that night, she stood outside the clinic on her lunch break, the card in her hand, and dialed. 1 ring. 2. I wasn't sure you'd use that number. His voice was clear and unhurried. the voice of someone who was never rushed by other people's expectations. I wasn't sure either, she said. The clinic received notice that the debt acquisition was blocked. Our director is calling it a legal technicality. It is a legal technicality, a convenient one. Most useful things are. A pause. Why help the clinic? You don't know us. I know you, he said. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, just considered. And I know that if you hadn't been working that shift, I wouldn't be having this conversation. She had no argument for that. It was simply true. Are we even? She asked. Not entirely. But I'd like to meet, properly, not in a parking lot. I have Thursdays off, she said. She hung up and went back inside. That afternoon, Marcus Vale sat across the city in a conference room on the 14th floor of his building and listened to Raymond Cole deliver the weekly operations summary. Raymond was 52, gray at the temples, and had been at Marcus's right hand for 20 years. He delivered information the way good assistants do, precisely, without editorializing, in the exact order of importance. After the summary, Raymond placed a freshwater pitcher on the table in front of Marcus. A small ritual. 20 years of the same motion, the same placement, the same unspoken precision. The nurse, Marcus said, when Raymond was done. Raymond's expression did not change. Sonia Cross. I've run a full background. Registered nurse. 11 years. Student loan debt. 47,000. No criminal record. No organizational connections. No significant relationships. A pause. Isolated. Manageable if that becomes necessary. Marcus looked at the report Raymond slid across the table. Read it. Then read the last line again. That won't be necessary, he said. You can't be certain she won't. She had 16 bullets and 2 hours. She called no one. She cleaned the room and showed up to her next shift. He'd set the report down. That tells me everything I need to know. Raymond said nothing further on the subject. He gathered his papers and left the room. The camera, if there were a camera, would have followed Raymond into the corridor. Would have caught the way he stopped just outside the door and stood very still for a moment. His face showed nothing dramatic. No anger, no visible calculation, just stillness. The kind that comes from a person who has just heard something they needed to think about privately. Marcus, alone in the conference room, picked up the water pitcher Raymond had placed on the table, poured a glass, drank, looked out at Detroit through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere across the city, a nurse with 47,000 of student debt had just put his phone number in her wallet and gone back to work. He did not know why that particular detail stayed with him through the rest of the afternoon. It just did. The coffee shop Sonia chose was small and close to the river, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. She picked it partly because it was convenient, partly because it was the kind of place where a man in an expensive suit would be slightly out of his element. She arrived 5 minutes early, chose a corner table with her back to the wall and a clear sightline to the entrance, a habit she had picked up years ago from a colleague who had spent time doing medical work in conflict zones. Always know your exits, the woman had told her, before you need them, not after. Marcus arrived at exactly the time he had said. No visible security. He was wearing a dark gray suit without a tie. She registered this immediately. No tie meant this was not, in his mind, an official meeting. He was making a small gesture toward informality, in the only vocabulary he knew. He sat down without ceremony. A slight nod in place of a handshake. The nod of someone who had decided that handshakes were sometimes just theater. You look better than the last time I saw you, Sonia said. Most people do without 16 bullets in them. Fair point. He ordered black coffee when the server came. From the shop, cracker cups, not of bottled water, not anything brought from outside. She noticed, filed it away next to everything else she had filed about him. Why a community clinic? He asked. Not in the way of an interrogator, in the way of someone who actually wanted to know. Because the people who come to St. Anselm don't have other options, she said. People who have options go somewhere better. I'd rather be useful than comfortable. He was quiet for a moment after that, not thinking of a response, processing something. She got the impression that sentence had landed somewhere specific. That's an expensive principle, he said. Most good ones are. Then he placed a thin folder on the table between them. The group that arranged the attack believes I may have a witness who can connect them to that night, he said. One of my men was seen bringing me into the clinic. They may eventually make the connection to you. She looked at the folder. Did not open it yet? What kind of man has 16 bullets removed in a back room and never contacts the police? She asked. The kind who built something that would collapse if the wrong people found out it was vulnerable for one night. That's an honest answer. I try. She opened the folder, 3 pages, a summary of the Chicago organization name, structure, assessed threat level. This was not information a businessman had. This was not what a private security firm produced. This was the kind of file that came from someone with deep structural connections to a world that ran parallel to the official one. This was the moment she understood. Not the 16 bullets in the back room, not the envelope under the windshield wiper. This folder. Because you did not have this kind of file on a criminal organization unless you were inside the same world they were in. Who exactly are you, Marcus Vale? She meant it as a real question this time. Someone who controls things that other people prefer to have left uncontrolled. That's not an answer. No, he said. But it's an honest acknowledgement that I'm not going to give you the complete one. She considered him across the table. Fair enough. She told him what she wanted. No guards. No being moved. She had taken care of herself for a long time, and she was not going to stop now. If my risk level changes significantly, you tell me, she said. Not daily updates, just if something materially changes. Agreed. And I want to know about the bullet I kept. He looked at her. You kept one. I don't throw away evidence until I understand it. There was a pause, and in that pause, something shifted. He was not looking at her the way he had been looking at her since he sat down, not assessing her as a risk or calculating her as a variable. He was looking at her the way you look at someone when they have surprised you in a way you were not prepared for. He told her about the bullet, the type, the origin, what it implied about the organization that had supplied the shooter. She listened, remembered everything. Thank you, she said. Why did you need to know? Because I need to understand what I'm adjacent to, even if I'm not in it. Near the end of the meeting, he reached for his jacket and a small piece of paper fell from his inner breast pocket. He picked it up quickly, but not quickly enough. She saw him look at it for a fraction of a second before putting it away. Old paper. Faded handwriting visible through the fold, not a business document. Something personal and old and carried with intention. She did not ask. Sonia. He stopped at the edge of the table. She looked up. If anything changes anything that makes you feel less safe, call first. Don't wait to see if it gets worse. Is that an order? It's a request. I don't have many people I'm able to say that sentence to. She drove home and searched his name online. The first result was a Business Journal article from 4 years ago, Vale Industrial Partners, one of Detroit's most influential private industrial brokers. A photograph at some business event. Same man, a little younger. No scandal, no investigative journalism. Nothing that would tell you what the man actually was. The absence of scandal at that level of power was not innocence, it was capability. The ability to keep your name clean while your influence ran through everything around it. She set her phone down. Okay, she said to the empty car. So that's who he is. Over the 4 weeks that followed, they built something that neither of them had a good word for. It was not friendship, it was not business. It was the kind of tentative, evidence-based trust that two careful people construct when they have accumulated enough proof that the other person is more reliable than most people in their lives. Not through feeling, but through repeated demonstration. He called on a Tuesday night to tell her the threat level from the Chicago group had dropped. The call lasted 47 seconds. She said understood, thank you, and hung up. She called him when a patient at the clinic unhoused. No insurance needed a surgery the clinic could not fund. She did not ask for a favor. She asked a direct question. Is there anything you can do? 2 days later, the patient was admitted to Riverside General. She sent a text. 2 words. It worked. He did not respond. But she found out later he read it 3 times before setting his phone down. He appeared at the clinic once to meet with the director about an employee education grant through one of his foundations. She saw him through the glass of the director's office while she was in the hall. He saw her see him. He nodded once through the glass. She nodded back. Both of them continued what they were doing. It was small. All of it was small. But small and consistent, over time, becomes something you can actually rely on. Raymond Cole watched all of it. He watched from a careful distance and said nothing. He added the name Sonia Cross to a private list that he kept in a notebook in his desk drawer at home, not at the office, not in any digital system. Just a notebook, in his own handwriting, at home where no one would look. The list was titled, simply, People Who Influence Marcus's Decisions Who I Cannot Control. And on the same night that he added her name to that list, Raymond made a phone call. The person on the other end of the line asked no questions. Raymond asked for a slight increase in the compound concentration. Not dramatic, small, calibrated, same risk profile, the person confirmed, just marginally faster. Yes, Raymond said, that's what I need. He hung up, sat in the quiet of his home office, feel like a man who had done something wrong. He felt like a man who was managing a situation that others could not see clearly enough to manage themselves. He had always been better at seeing clearly than Marcus. That was why Marcus needed him. That was why Marcus would always need him. He believed that completely. He had believed it for 20 years. It was the foundation of everything. Dr. Carol Hayes was meticulous in a way that most of her colleagues found excessive, and that Marcus Vail had, over the years, come to rely on entirely. She kept handwritten notes alongside her digital records. She plotted her patient's progression on paper charts as well as in the electronic system, because she believed that seeing a line drawn by hand told you something that a computer-generated graph sometimes obscured. She had been doing this since medical school and had never found a reason to stop. On a Thursday morning in October, she sat at her desk and drew 2 lines on a sheet of graph paper. The first line was the expected progression curve for Marcus's neurological condition, the rate of decline that the medical literature predicted for a patient at his age, his baseline health, and his documented presentation. She had drawn this line 8 months ago when she gave him the diagnosis, and she had looked at it many times since. It was not a gentle line, but it was a manageable one, a line that allowed for years of functional quality before significant decline. The second line was Marcus's actual progression over the past 8 months. She drew it carefully, point by point, from the data in his file. Then she sat back and looked at both lines together. The gap between them was wrong. Not in the way that individual variation was wrong. Patients varied. Some progressed faster, some slower. That was normal. This was wrong in a different way. Marcus's line was not just faster than expected. It was too consistent, too regular. It moved in a pattern that looked less like biological variation and more like something being applied from outside, at controlled intervals. She sat with this observation for a long time before she let herself complete the thought it was building toward. Then she wrote a note on paper, not in the electronic system, on paper which she folded and put in her personal bag. The note said, Independent Tox Panel, Outside Lab. Do not discuss with patient until results confirmed. The outside lab was in Ann Arbor. She had a professional connection there through a conference she had attended 3 years ago, a toxicologist she had spoken with briefly at a dinner, whose card she had kept because she had found the conversation interesting. She called the number on a Saturday from her personal cell phone and arranged to send a sample under a name that was not her own. The sample came from Marcus's private water pitcher. She took it on a Monday afternoon when he stepped out of his office for a meeting. She had a standing access arrangement for medical follow-up, and his assistant let her in without question. 10 milliliters in a small sealed vial, carried in her coat pocket, transferred to a courier package that afternoon. She waited 7 days. The result came by encrypted email on a Tuesday morning. She read it at her kitchen table before leaving for the office. Positive. Synthetic compound. Neural enzyme suppressant category. Artificially produced, no natural origin. Concentration levels low and consistent, indicating prolonged exposure over an extended period. 3 times. Then she made a phone call, not to Marcus, not to anyone in his organization, to a colleague at the University of Michigan Medical School who specialized in forensic toxicology. She described the compound without mentioning any names and asked a single question. How long would exposure at these concentration levels need to continue to produce the kind of neurological progression I'm describing? 6 to 9 months minimum, her colleague said. Possibly longer, depending on individual metabolic factors. And whoever designed this protocol knew what they were doing. The concentration is calibrated to look like natural progression. You'd only catch it if you were specifically looking for it. Or if the progression was moving faster than it should, Carol said. Yes. Exactly. She thanked him and ended the call. She did not call Marcus. She drove to his office building, took the elevator to his floor, and told his assistant she needed 5 minutes, private. Marcus read the lab result without speaking. She watched him the way she always watched patients receiving significant information, tracking the face, the posture, the micro expressions that told her more than words. His face showed nothing visible, but there was a change in the room, the way there is a change in pressure before a storm arrives. Something behind his stillness shifted. How long? He said. She knew he was not asking about the disease. Based on the concentration decay rates, 6 to 8 months of consistent exposure, possibly longer. He looked at the water pitcher on his desk. He picked it up and set it on the floor beside the desk. Quietly, without drama. Just moved it out of reach. Can we treat it now that we know what it is? The compound itself, yes. Stop the exposure. Begin elimination. The underlying condition. She paused, because Carol Hayes was someone who said hard things plainly. Without the artificial acceleration, your prognosis changes significantly. Years rather than months. A slower rate of progression. He was quiet for a moment. Who has access to that picture? I can't answer that. You know your environment better than I do. He nodded slowly. 3 days before you make any of this official. Marcus, I need to know who before I move. If I move wrong, they disappear. She looked at him for a moment. She had been his doctor long enough to understand the particular arithmetic of his world, that some decisions required sequence, and that disrupting the sequence could cost more than waiting. 3 days, she said. After that, I begin treatment regardless of where you are. 3 days. Thank you, Carol. She left. He sat alone in his office. He reached into his inner breast pocket and took out the folded piece of paper he had carried for 15 years. Old paper, soft with handling. He opened it fully. A woman's handwriting, faded but legible. One address, a town in another state. And one sentence, call me when you're ready. D. Diana. He had searched for her for 3 years after she disappeared. Then Raymond had come to him with the news, a car accident out of state, identified through records that Raymond had obtained. He had not seen the records himself. He had trusted Raymond to read them for him because he could not look at them himself at the time. He had been in a place, then, where certain things were too much to look at directly. He set the paper on his desk, the water pitcher, on the floor, placed there by reflex, before his mind had finished assembling the full picture. Raymond placed that pitcher on his desk every morning. 20 years, the same ritual, the same precision. Raymond knew about Diana because Marcus had told only him when it happened. Raymond knew about the diagnosis because Raymond had been present in the early appointments before Marcus began requesting private meetings with Carol. Raymond would be made completely redundant by the organizational transfer. Marcus had spent the last 8 months planning. He sat with these facts arranged in front of him like pieces of a document he was being asked to sign. His left hand rested on the desk, the familiar slight tremor. He looked at it for a long time without moving. Who has been at my side for 20 years? He said quietly. To nobody. And who would lose the most when I stepped down? Sonia was finishing a morning shift on a Thursday when the man in the navy suit appeared outside the clinic entrance. She saw him through the glass of the reception area, well-dressed, briefcase, the kind of posture that came from years of being paid to project confidence. Not a patient, not a delivery person, waiting. She went out through the front door. Ms. Cross. He extended a business card. David Pratt. I represent a coalition of healthcare investment interests. I understand you've had recent contact with Marcus Vale. She took the card. Read it. I have a lot of patience, she said. Mr. Vale is not your patient. Is that a question or a statement? He produced an envelope from his briefcase. She could see from the shape and weight of it that there was a document inside, not just a letter. The kind of envelope that contained a significant financial offer. We believe you may have information about Mr. Vale's activities that would be valuable to a legitimate business investigation. You would be well compensated for a written statement. She looked at the envelope. She did not take it. Mister, she said, I don't know what you're referring to, and I'd suggest you speak to an attorney before approaching me again. Miss Cross, we're simply good morning. She went back inside, stood in the hallway with her back to the wall, away from the windows. The clinical part of her brain was already running through the implications. David Pratt. The firm name on the card, she was memorizing it, the way she memorized medication names and dosage thresholds. Who sent him? Who told him to come here? Who told him that she and Marcus had a connection? Only two people knew about that night. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus. She Pulwer approached this morning, he said, before she had finished her opening sentence. You're having me watched. I'm watching everyone who moves around my name. That's not the same thing. Did you know they would come to me? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be meaningful. No, which means someone told them. And the only person who knew is whoever you told, she said. Silence. I told Raymond, he said. She thought about what she knew of Raymond, which was not much, just the figure she had seen at Marcus's side during that brief window of time. The person Marcus referred to when he said things like Raymond will handle that. Raymond has the details. Raymond, 20 years is a long time to be wrong about someone, she said. Yes, he said, just the one word. But the space inside it was large. He asked her to send a written account of the interaction, everything she remembered, exact words, time of approach, description of Pratt. She wrote it out from memory while standing in the supply corridor between patients and sent it within 15 minutes. He responded, Don't answer if he contacts you again. She typed back, I know how to not answer a phone, Marcus. 3 seconds. Then, I know you do. Marcus, meanwhile, moved carefully. He did not go to Raymond. He did not confront anyone. He did the thing that people who understood information did first. He tested. He created a piece of false intelligence. A meeting, supposedly scheduled for the following weekend, at a specific location, with a specific name attached. He embedded this information in a conversation with Raymond and nowhere else. Then he waited. On Friday morning, his security monitoring team flagged unusual activity near that location. A vehicle that had no business being there, parked and watching. Marcus received the report in his office. Read it, set it down. Poured a glass of water from a bottle he had brought from home. Drank. 20 years. He thought about the water pitcher on his office floor, where he had moved it 4 days ago. He thought about Carol's lab results, still folded in his pocket, alongside Diantha's note. He thought about the 3 days he had asked for, and how 2 of them were now gone. He thought about Raymond's face across 20 years of meetings, calm, competent, loyal. Always the last one in the room after everyone else had left. Always there. He had never asked why Raymond stayed. You did not ask why people were loyal. You were grateful and you moved forward. That was how the work got done. He understood, sitting in his office with a water bottle from home and a piece of false intelligence confirmed by reality, that the absence of that question had cost him more than he could calculate at this moment. That evening, Sonia's phone rang at 10 p.m. Are you home? Marcus asked. Yes. A pause. I wanted to make sure. You could have texted. I could have. They were quiet on the line together for a moment. She was in her kitchen that had gone slightly cold. He was, she imagined, in some room she had never seen, looking at something she did not know about. Marcus. Yes. The person who told them about me, it's someone very close to you. Yes. How are you handling that? Carefully. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She put her fork down. Be careful. Actually careful. Not the kind you say automatically. The kind that means you're paying attention to what's right in front of you. A long silence. Good night, Sonia. She hung up and sat for a while at the kitchen table, in the ordinary quiet of her ordinary apartment, thinking about a man she barely knew who was carrying something very heavy in a world she did not fully understand. She did not know why she kept thinking about him. She just did. The third day came. Marcus drove himself to Carol's office. No driver, no Raymond, no one from his team. He parked in the underground structure and took the elevator up alone. Carol was waiting. She had the treatment protocol ready. She had also, in the 3 days since their previous conversation, done additional research and prepared a document she placed on the table before he sat down. Before we begin, she said, I want to give you the complete picture. The document showed two things. The first was the compound, its structure, its mechanism, how it interacted with the specific type of neurological deterioration Marcus had. The second was a reconstruction, based on the concentration levels and the progression data, of when the exposure had most likely begun. 8 to 9 months ago, Carol said, based on when your numbers first started diverging from the expected curve. 8 to 9 months ago. Marcus had told Raymond about the diagnosis approximately 8 months ago. He had told no one else. He read the document to the end. Then he folded it in half and put it in his pocket next to Diana's note. Start the treatment, he said. There's something else you should understand, Carol said. The compound was administered at very low, very consistent doses. Whoever did this was not trying to kill you quickly. They were trying to manage you, to keep you declining at a pace they could control. So I would have time, but not too much time, Marcus said. Exactly. Enough time to remain functional, but on a declining trajectory that made a full organizational transfer increasingly impractical. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, What's the revised prognosis? Assuming we eliminate the compound and I follow whatever protocol you prescribe. Conservatively, 5 to 7 years of strong functionality. Potentially a decade. The underlying condition is yours, and it is real. But without someone pushing it from outside, it becomes a condition you manage rather than a countdown you're running against. 5 to 7 years, he said. He looked out the window of her office. Detroit in the morning, ordinary and ongoing, completely unaware of the conversation happening 12 floors above it. I had built everything around 3 years, he said. Every decision for the past 8 months. The transfer time, the financial restructuring, the succession planning, all of it was built around 3 years. And now you have more time than that. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. That is a stranger feeling than I expected. Carol began the first treatment of protocol designed to accelerate the elimination of the compound from his system while monitoring for any complications. She worked in silence, and he sat in her examination chair and looked at the wall. Carol, he said, toward the end of the appointment. Yes. The person who did this, they would have needed access to the compound from a specialized source, not something you find through ordinary channels. Correct. It would require either significant medical knowledge or a very specific supplier, possibly both. He nodded. Said nothing more on the subject. He drove back across the city, parked underground in his building, sat in the car for a few minutes before going up. He was going to have to see Raymond today. He was going to have to sit in the same room with Raymond and have a normal conversation and give nothing away. Because if Raymond knew he was suspected, Raymond would vanish. And Marcus needed Raymond to not vanish, not yet. He needed Raymond to remain exactly where he was for a little while longer. This was the particular discipline of the world Marcus had built his life inside the ability to know something completely and show nothing. He had practiced it for decades. It had never cost him anything he valued, until now. He took the elevator up. Raymond was waiting in the outer office as he always was. With the day's schedule and the water pitcher a new pitcher, this one never opened. Marcus looked at the pitcher, looked at Raymond. Smiled the way he always smiled, minimal, controlled. The smile of a man who found a certain dry satisfaction in the ongoing business of his day. What's first? He said. Conference call at 10, Raymond said. The Henderson Group. Then a site review at 2. Let's go, Marcus said, and they walked into the morning together, 20 years of trust and the truth about it occupying the same space, The way two things can coexist for a little while longer when one of them does not yet know what the other one knows. Raymond figured it out on a Friday. He had been tracking the false intelligence not because he suspected it was false, but because he tracked everything. It was his habit, his method, the thing that had made him indispensable for 2 decades. You tracked what moved, you logged what changed, you noticed what didn't fit. The reconnaissance activity near the false meeting location he had authorized that, through intermediaries, to verify what he believed was a genuine tip. When the meeting did not happen and the location turned out to be empty and unremarkable, he ran the sequence backward. Who had given him that location? Marcus, in a conversation that had felt ordinary, in a conversation that, when he examined it again with fresh eyes, had been carefully constructed. He sat in his car on a side street for a long time. Marcus knew. Not everything, but enough to test, enough to build a trap and wait. Raymond thought about this with the same careful precision he brought to everything. He was not panicked. Panic was for people who had not prepared. Raymond had always prepared. The problem was Sonia Cross. She was the element he had not anticipated, the variable that had introduced itself without warning, and was now sitting at the center of everything, changing Marcus in ways that Raymond could see but not stop. Marcus was different. Small differences, the kind that would not register to most observers. He was slightly less isolated. He was slightly more willing to be in a room where not everything was controlled. He had started answering personal calls during work hours, which he had never done before. These were not just these are signs of a man who was beginning to remember that there was a world outside the one he had built, and to find that world interesting. Raymond could not allow that to continue. He made a call, told the intermediary to increase the pressure on Sonia Cross. Not violence, not yet, not directly. Pressure. The kind that came from being watched consistently, from understanding that your movements were being documented, that the space around you was getting smaller. The goal was simple: create a situation that would require Marcus to focus on the crisis rather than the investigation. A man managing an active threat to someone he had decided to protect did not have bandwidth left over for tracing compound sources. It worked for a few days. Sonia noted the surveillance on day 1 and said nothing. She noticed it again on day 3 and started keeping records. By day 10, she had a pattern documented with the precision of a clinical chart. She called Marcus at 9 in the evening. "The situation has changed," she said. "Someone has been tracking my movements for 10 days. Every day, same pattern. This is not occasional observation. This is mapping." Marcus listened without interrupting. "Send me everything you recorded." She sent it. He read it in 2 minutes. Then, "Where are you right now?" "Home." "Pack for 3 days. I'll come get you." 20 minutes. "You don't have to." 20 minutes, Sonia. She packed light, and practically she was a person who knew how to pack quickly, having spent years being called in on short notice. She was ready in 15. The apartment Marcus took her to was not his. It was a midpoint location, a clean, ordinary apartment in a nondescript building, registered under a name she did not recognize. He had held these kinds of places for years. Contingency spaces, he would have called them if he were the kind of person who explained things. It was 11 at night when they sat down at the kitchen table. No romance, no drama. A map of Detroit, her written records of the surveillance, 2 cups of coffee, and 2 people working through a problem. He walked her through the short-term plan. She listened, asked 2 practical questions, confirmed her understanding. Then she asked a third question that was not practical. "Marcus, how long have you had the tremor?" His left hand was on the table, had been on the table throughout the conversation. And in the middle of explaining something on the map, it had shaken enough that he knocked over his coffee cup. He looked at his hand, wiped up the spill, did not put the hand in his pocket. 8 months, he said. Officially. Unofficially longer? I think someone has been helping it along. She did not react the way most people would have reacted. She did not gasp, did not reach across the table, did not fill the space with motion. She looked at him with the measured steadiness of someone who had received too many terrible pieces of news to treat any single one of them as exceptional. Have you confirmed it? 3 days ago. Who? I don't know yet with certainty. I have a very strong suspicion I don't want to be having. She was quiet for a moment. The hardest evidence to accept is the kind that proves someone you trusted. Yes, he said. Exactly that. He reached into his pocket, took out the folded piece of paper, placed it on the table between them without opening it. There's something else. Something from 15 years ago that I believe is connected to everything happening now. I'm not ready to explain all of it yet, but I wanted you to know it exists. Sonia looked at the paper, did not ask to see it, did not ask what it said. Okay, she said. Okay, when you're ready. I'm not going anywhere tonight. He looked at her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not a polite sound or a social reflex. An actual laugh, the kind that comes out when something strikes you as genuinely, unexpectedly funny because it is so perfectly understated. You are a very unusual person, Sonia Cross. Says the man with 16 bullet scars and a mysterious piece of paper. They sat for a while in the quiet of the midpoint apartment, in a city that did not know they were there, with a truth that was almost completely assembled now, waiting for the last few pieces to fall into place. The next morning, Marcus took a call in the living room while Sonia sat at the side table with her coffee, reading through a stack of documents he had left out, organizational records, financial summaries, the kind of material she had learned to read without fully registering the deeper implications. When she turned a page, a photograph fell out. She picked it up. It was a candid photo 4 by 6 inches, the kind taken with a real camera rather than a phone. A woman standing near a window, looking out. She didn't know she was being photographed. The light came from the left, afternoon light, and it caught the angle of her face in a way that made the image feel very private. Sonia looked at the photograph for a long moment. 3 years ago, Portland, Oregon, a short-term audit contract for a small logistics company. One of the staff accountants was a woman who had introduced herself as Helen Marsh. Quiet, methodical, the kind of person who handled numbers with a particular care, the care of someone who had learned to leave minimal traces of themselves in everything they touched. They had interacted maybe half a dozen times, briefly, over the course of the engagement. Nothing memorable about the interactions themselves, but Sonia remembered her for one specific reason. During a casual conversation about cities they had worked in, Sonia had mentioned Detroit, and Helen Marsh had stopped completely, visibly stopped, and then redirected the conversation immediately. Smoothly, practiced. The way you redirected a conversation that you had redirected many times before. The woman in this photograph was Helen Marsh. Who is this? Sonia asked. Marcus looked up from his call, saw the photograph. He finished the call in 2 words and set the phone down. Someone I knew a long time ago, he said. Is she still alive? No. Sonia looked at the photograph again, then at him. Are you certain? The way she asked it, not as a passing question, not with any particular drama, but with the specific weight of someone who had a reason for asking, made him set his phone completely aside. What do you know, Sonia? She told him. Exactly and in order. Portland. The audit engagement. The woman named Helen Marsh. The way she handled numbers. The reaction to the word Detroit. I only met her a few times. I'm not certain of everything. But I know faces. And that woman, she held up the photograph. That is the same person. Marcus was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that was not waiting for words, but was something else, the sound of a very large structure being rebuilt in real time, from the foundation. Her name is Diana, he said finally. She's alive, apparently. You didn't know. I was told she died 15 years ago. Car accident, out of state. A pause. I was told by Raymond. Sonia set the photograph down on the table between them. She said, Call Raymond. Now, have him come here. Marcus called Raymond and asked him to come to the midpoint apartment. He gave Raymond the address. He said it was urgent and that he would explain when Raymond arrived. He said it in the tone he used for everything calm, precise, giving nothing away. Raymond arrived 40 minutes later. He saw Sonia in the room. The muscles around his jaw tightened slightly, a small movement that Sonia noticed because she had been watching for it. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not begin with an accusation. He placed the laboratory report from Carol on the table. Do you know anything about this? Raymond looked at the paper. His eyes moved across it. He was a reader. He read quickly, retained everything, had always processed information faster than most people Marcus had ever employed. He read it, looked up. Then he sat back in his chair, not in comfort, in something more like the posture of a person who has decided that maintaining the performance is no longer worth the energy it requires. I never wanted to hurt you, Raymond said. Deanna is alive. The sentence fell into the room like a stone into still water. Raymond was silent, and the silence was a complete sentence. She was alive, and you told me she was dead, Marcus said. You arranged for her to leave and then told me she died. And for the past 8 months, you have been putting something in my water that has been accelerating a disease I didn't know I was carrying. He paused. Help me understand, Raymond. I've known you for 20 years, and none of this makes sense to me. Raymond looked at him. And then, in the voice of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place where carrying it is no longer possible, he began to speak. Diane was going to take you away, he said. From everything we built. You were considering leaving Detroit, leaving the organization, leaving all of it. I could see it happening, so you sent her away. I showed her the truth of your life. Real things. I did not fabricate anything, but I showed them to her in a way that made her believe she was not safe staying. She had no reason not to believe me, and then you told me she was dead. Because if you knew she was alive, you would have found her, and you would have chosen her over everything we had built, and 20 years of work would have. He stopped. Started again. 8 months ago, you told me you were planning to transfer the organization, that the transition would be complete, that I would be. He paused, taken care of. You would have been, Marcus said. I didn't want to be taken care of. Raymond's voice was very quiet now. I wanted to matter. I have mattered for 20 years because you needed me. If you transferred power to someone new and walked away from this world, I would stop mattering. I couldn't. He stopped. I could not allow that. So you poisoned me. I slowed you down. I thought if the timeline shortened, if you were too unwell to complete a full transition, you would keep me close. You would need me to manage things. You would not be able to step back. The room was very still. You took 15 years from me, Marcus said. From her. From whatever we could have become. I know, and you took my health. I know. Marcus looked at Raymond across the table, a man he had known for 20 years, a man who had been present for almost every significant moment of the last 2 decades. A man he had trusted so completely that the word trust had stopped having content, it had just become the permanent, unexamined condition of Raymond being there. Leave, Marcus said. Raymond stood slowly. Marcus, Raymond. The voice was level and final, the way a door is final when it closes. Leave. When the door shut, Sonia stayed where she was for a moment. Then she walked to the table and sat down beside him, not across from him. Beside him. She did not say anything. She was just there. I gave him 20 years of trust, Marcus said. I never once asked why he stayed. In your world, you don't ask why people are loyal, she said quietly. You're just grateful when they are. Yes. That's not loyalty, she said. That's dependency. On both sides. He absorbed that. On both sides. Outside the window, Detroit went on. Traffic sounds, the distant noise of the city's ordinary life, completely indifferent to what had just happened in this room. Marcus did not have Raymond killed. This was the decision that surprised people later, when the story reached the edges of the circles where such stories circulate. In the world Marcus had operated in for 20 years, betrayal of the kind Raymond had committed was handled in a specific way. Everyone knew the way. It was old and efficient, and did not involve the legal system. Marcus chose differently. He compiled the documentation, Carol's lab report, the toxicology analysis, a written account of Raymond's confession with Sonia as witness, the historical record of what Raymond had done to Diana 15 years ago, and handed it to an independent attorney with instructions to proceed through federal channels. Aggravated poisoning, conspiracy, related charges, the legal system, the actual one. He explained why to Sonia, sitting at the kitchen table of the midpoint apartment on the morning after Raymond had left. Raymond's logic, the thing that let him believe any of this, was acceptable lives inside a very specific assumption, Marcus said. The assumption that the world I operated in ran outside normal consequences. That loyalty at this level meant different rules. That actions taken up here didn't have to be answered for down there. And you want to prove him wrong, Sonia said. I want to be done with the system where betrayal gets handled by making the person disappear. Because that system, the one I built and lived inside, is exactly what created the conditions that allowed Raymond to become what he became. He was quiet for a moment. The rules I lived by helped create the man who poisoned me. I have to sit with that. Sonja listened, did not argue with it, did not soften it, just received it. That takes a certain kind of courage, she said. Or a certain kind of exhaustion, he said. I'm not always sure which one it is. He went to see Carol that afternoon. His second appointment in 2 weeks, a record, given how consistently he had avoided her office for the better part of a year. She reviewed the initial treatment response and updated the prognosis. Without the compound continuing, and assuming you followed the full protocol, we are looking at 5 to 7 years of strong functionality. Possibly a decade. The underlying condition is real, and we're not eliminating it. But we are removing the accelerant. 5 to 7 years, he said. Conservatively, yes. He looked out her window for a moment. 8 months ago, you told me I had approximately 3 years. I built every decision I made since then around that number. And now the number has changed significantly. Yes. A pause. It is a strange thing. I had adjusted to the shorter version. The longer version requires a different kind of thinking. What kind? The kind where you have to answer for more. Where you have enough time to be responsible for whether you do things right, and not just whether you finish them. Carol said, most people find that harder. Most people are correct, he said. That evening, in the quiet of his own apartment, the first night he had slept in his own apartment, in several days Marcus Vale sat at his desk and wrote a letter by hand. He wrote it. The first time it was 3 pages and said too much. The second time it was 1 paragraph and said exactly what needed to be said. I know you're alive. I know the version of events you were given. I have since learned the version you weren't given. I am not angry, not at you, not at any choice you made with the information you had. Whatever you decide to do with this letter is entirely your decision. I did not write it to ask for anything. I wrote it because you deserve to know that I know. M. He sealed it and addressed it to the Oregon town that Sonia had remembered from 3 years ago. In the morning, he mailed it. Then he went back to work. The organizational transfer continued, but differently now. Not driven by a 3-year deadline. Not shaped by the urgency of a man who believed he was running out of time. The person he designated as his successor was someone Raymond would never have chosen. Younger, from outside the existing structure, without the weight of 20 years of decisions made inside a system that Marx was now beginning to see clearly required fundamental change. You're making yourself irrelevant, one of his longest-standing partners said during a meeting where this transition was discussed. I'm making myself free, Marcus replied. There's a meaningful difference. He still worked. He would probably always work, in some form. But the meetings ended at their scheduled times. He was not the last person in every room anymore. He began, slowly and imperfectly, to understand the difference between controlling everything and managing what actually mattered. Sonia returned to the clinic, to her patients, to the work that had always been the fixed point around which everything else in her life orbited. She did not tell anyone about the weeks that had just passed. It was not her story to tell, or rather, the parts of it that were hers to tell were parts she did not have words for yet. The words would come, she thought. They usually did, eventually. You just had to give them time to arrive. 3 weeks after the letter was mailed, Marcus received a response, a single sentence on a plain card, in handwriting he had not seen in 15 years. I know. I'm not ready yet. But I'm glad you know. He read it 4 times. Then he put it in his desk drawer, next to the folded piece of paper with the faded address which he no longer needed to carry in his pocket, because the reason he had been carrying it was no longer a question without an answer. 6 weeks after Raymond Cole left the Midpoint apartment, his name appeared in federal court documents for the first time. The charges were significant. The legal process was slow, as it always was. Raymond had resources and connections and attorneys who knew how to extend timelines, but his name was in the documents. It was on record. The consequence was real, and it was public, and it could not be called back. This was, Marcus had decided, the point. Not speed, not finality. The point was that consequence existed in the visible world, where it could not be managed or disappeared or redefined. Raymond had operated for 20 years on the belief that certain actions taken at certain levels of power lived outside that world. The federal filing was simply a statement, a very expensive, very official, very permanent statement that this belief had been wrong. The St. Anselm Community Clinic received a formal notification in the same week. Its outstanding institutional debt had been fully retired. The single condition attached was that the clinic maintain its community service model for a period of 3 years, with quarterly verification. The source of the funds was listed as a private charitable trust, and nothing further was provided. The clinic director called it a miracle. Earl, the security guard, said he had always known the place had good karma. 2 of the nurses cried, briefly, in the break room. Sonia did not cry. She read the notification letter twice, set it on the director's desk, and went back to her patients. She knew where the money came from. She did not say so to anyone. That was not because she was protecting Marcus. She was not in the business of protecting powerful men. She did not say so because the clinic's debt being gone was a fact that stood on its own, and attaching a name to it would have complicated the fact in ways that would not have helped anyone. The patients who came through the door every week did not need to know the story behind the funding. They needed the clinic to be open, and now it would stay open, and that was enough. Marcus was at Carol's office on a Tuesday morning, on time, without canceling. Carol wrote 2 words in his chart, on time. She had been his physician for 6 years, and it was the first time she had written those words. His treatment was progressing well. The compound was clearing his system at the expected rate. The underlying condition was presenting, now, at the pace it was always supposed to present, slower, more gradual, the kind of thing that could be managed alongside a full life rather than run away from it. She did not make a speech about it. She gave him the data, explained the next steps in the protocol, scheduled the follow-up appointment. That was what good medicine looked like, in her experience. Information clearly given. Next steps clearly explained. The patient's job to do something useful with it. He drove back across the city, stopped at a coffee shop he had never been to before, one of the small ones, close to the river. Ordered coffee in a regular cup and sat at a table near the window and looked out at the street for an hour. He thought about Raymond. Not with anger, or rather, the anger had been there and had passed through him and was now something quieter. Something more like comprehension. Raymond had loved him in the only way Raymond knew how to love, completely, possessively, in a way that could not survive its object becoming free. There was no reasoning with that kind of love, and there was no forgiving it in the simple transactional sense of the word. There was only the slow work of understanding it clearly enough to not carry it forward. He thought about Diana, her single card, in the drawer of his desk. I know, I'm not ready yet, but I'm glad you know. He thought about what it meant to have spent 15 years grieving someone who was alive. He thought about what it meant to have built an entire architecture of decisions and habits and walls on the foundation of a loss that had not been real. He did not have words for most of what he thought. That was all right. Words came later, or they didn't. The thinking mattered more than the naming of it. He thought about Sonia, not in a complicated way. He thought about her the way you think about a fixed point when everything around it has been moving with a particular kind of clarity that comes from contrast. She had removed 60 bullets from his body without knowing who he was. She had kept his confidence without being asked to. She had told him the truth about Diana without hesitation, without calculating what it would cost her. She had sat beside him in a kitchen at midnight when he told her about his hand, and she had not made it into something she needed to manage or fix. She had just been there. He did not know what that was or what it would become. He thought it was probably too early to have a word for it, and that having a word for it too soon would be a way of controlling it, and that controlling it would ruin it. He had controlled enough things. He was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to hold certain things more lightly. He finished his coffee, left a tip that was probably excessive, drove home. That evening, his phone rang at 9 p.m., an Oregon area code. He looked at the screen for a long moment, then he answered now. Marcus. Her voice was the same, 15 years, and it was the same. Diana. A silence, the particular silence of two people giving the fact of talking to each other, permission to exist before either of them says another word. He did not hear her begin to cry, and he did not hear himself. What he heard was the sound of a conversation that was going to be long and difficult and necessary, and, somewhere on the far side of that difficulty, possibly something else entirely. He was not going to try to name what the other side looked like. He had learned that lesson, if nothing else. I got letter, she said. I know. I didn't know, she said. What he told me, I had no reason not to believe him. You have to know that. I do know that, he said. I know exactly how he told the truth in a way that was designed to be believed. I know exactly how good he was at it. I am not holding what you did against you. She was quiet for a moment. He told you I was dead. Yes. And you believed him. Yes, I did. A pause. I should have looked harder. That is on me. Marcus, I should have looked harder, he said again, not to argue, but because it was true, and he had gotten to the point where saying true things mattered more than managing how he appeared. I stopped looking because looking was too painful, and I told myself the pain was grief. But part of it was that I had someone telling me there was nothing to find, and I trusted that more than I trusted myself. She was quiet. Whenever you're ready, he said. There is no deadline. There is no expectation. I wrote the letter because you deserve to know. What happens after that is entirely yours. I'm in Medford, she said. I've been here for 12 years. I have a job. I have a life that is smaller than the one I had before, but it's mine. I'm glad, he said. And he meant it. They talked for another 40 minutes. He did not ask questions she was not ready for. She did not ask questions he could not yet answer. What they did was simpler and harder than either of those things they talked the way two people talk when they are locating each other across a great distance, not rushing to close the gap, just learning where the other person actually is. When he hung up, he sat for a while in his office in the quiet. His left hand rested on the desk. The slight, familiar tremor. He looked at it, not with the calculating eye of someone assessing a mechanical failure, and not with the resignation of someone counting down. Just looked at it, a part of him, real and present and his. He reached into his pocket and took out the folded paper, the one he had carried for 15 years. Diana's address, faded with handling, soft with years of being opened and refolded and carried and opened again. He opened it one more time. Looked at the address, looked at the single line of her handwriting, call me when you're ready. He took a pen from his desk, crossed out the address gently, wrote a phone number beside it, the numbers she had called him from tonight. Then he folded the paper, put it back in his pocket, and stood up. He put on his jacket. His left hand trembled on the third button. He waited, tried again, stood there for a moment, in the quiet of his office, in the building that still bore his name, in the city that had defined everything about the life he had built. Then he walked out. Across the city, in a studio apartment with medical textbooks along one wall, Sonia Cross was at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that was still warm. She had her laptop open and was reviewing the financial disclosure documents for a small manufacturing company in Wisconsin, not her usual work, but interesting in the specific way that anomalies in financial structures were interesting to her. A note in the email forwarding the document said simply, "Thought you might find the Q3 discrepancy in section 4.2 interesting. Entirely optional." MV, she had read section 4.2. He was right. It was interesting. She was thinking about calling him to discuss it, and also thinking about what it meant that she was thinking about that and also thinking that she spent too much time thinking about what things meant rather than simply doing them. She reached into the small drawer at the side of the table, took out a piece of paper she had put there 3 weeks ago, the card with the address he had originally used to contact her, from the envelope under her windshield wiper. She had kept it without consciously deciding to keep it. She had put it in the drawer without consciously deciding what that meant. She looked at it for a moment. She was not someone who made decisions before she was ready to make them. She had learned, at some cost, the difference between patience and avoidance, and she had learned that the way you told the difference was whether the waiting was making you smaller or making you more certain. She put the card back in the drawer, closed it. Outside, Detroit was doing what Detroit always did at this hour, moving, working, being itself in all its complicated and unfinished glory. Tomorrow she had an early shift, a difficult patient she was worried about, a follow-up call to make with a specialist across town. The ordinary ongoing business of a life that had, without her particularly planning it, become slightly larger than it had been 2 months ago. She closed her laptop, picked up her phone, dialed. He answered on the second ring. "There's a discrepancy in the Wisconsin documents," she said. "Section 4.2. It's not fraud, but it could be misread as something worse than it is. Someone should correct it before the quarterly review." "I know," he said. "I wanted to see if you'd catch it." She considered that for a moment. "You sent me a test. I sent you something interesting. You turned it into a test." "That's not my fault." It was, she realized. The second time he had made her almost laugh without appearing to try. She was beginning to think this was a skill and not an accident. "I'll send you the corrected analysis tomorrow," she said. "Thank you, Sonia." "Good night, Marcus." She set her phone down, sat in the quiet kitchen with the warm tea and the ordinary sounds of the building around her. There was a word she had been avoiding for a few weeks now, because she was not certain it was accurate. And she did not use words she was not certain were accurate. The word was trust. She was not sure she trusted Marcus Vale in the full and uncomplicated sense of the word. She was not sure trust was the right frame for whatever this was. What she was sure of was something simpler. She was sure he was someone who had looked at the worst version of himself, the version that had built a world on a buried truth, the version that had let someone stand at his side for 20 years without asking why, and had not looked away from it. He had changed the rule, even when changing it was harder than keeping it. He had sent a letter to Oregon that asked for nothing. She was sure he was someone who had been given more time than he thought he had, and was trying imperfectly and slowly to use it differently. She was not sure where that left them, but she thought it left them somewhere real. That was enough. For now, that was enough. She drank her tea, washed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. Outside, Detroit held its breath for just a moment, that specific stillness before the next shift began, before the next set of people took over the streets. The city that had built and broken and rebuilt itself so many times that reinvention was simply part of its nature. Then it exhaled and moved forward, and the night continued. The way nights always do. He had spent 20 years being the most informed person in any room. He had never been told the most important things by the people who were closest to him. It turns out that information is not the same as truth. The difference between the two is exactly the size of the space where someone you trusted used to stand. The hardest thing a powerful man can learn is not how to hold more. It is how to hold the right things lightly enough that they do not become weapons. And how to recognize, before it costs you everything, the difference between the person who stays because they love you and the person who stays because they cannot survive you leaving. He was a slow learner on that last part, but he was learning. And at 48, with a hand that sometimes did not cooperate and a phone number written beside a crossed-out address in Oregon, that was enough to start with. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.
There is a moment in this story that has nothing to do with power. It happens in a back room at midnight. A woman with $47,000 of student debt and a portable surgical lamp is removing bullets from a stranger she has never met. She does not know his name. She does not know what he controls. She does not know that half of Detroit answers to him. She just knows he is dying, and she knows how to help. That moment, that single, unremarkable act of choosing to help without knowing what it will cost is the entire story. Everything else is just what happens because of it. Here is the first lesson. The most powerful people in any room are not always the ones with the most resources. They are the ones who act on their values when it would be easier not to. Sonia Cross had every reason to walk past that dumpster and go home. She had a loan payment due on Friday. She had a shift the next morning. She had a life that was already demanding more than it gave back. She stopped anyway. She helped anyway. And that one decision made in the dark, with no audience, with nothing to gain, changed the course of 2 lives. Here is the second lesson. The most dangerous threat you will ever face does not come from your enemies. It comes from the people you have stopped questioning. Marcus Vail controlled an entire industrial network. He could read a room, detect a lie, outmaneuver organizations that had been trying to undo him for years. But he had never once asked why Raymond stayed. Never asked why someone as capable as Raymond had chosen to remain in a supporting role for 2 full decades. He assumed loyalty because loyalty had been present. And the moment you stop examining what is right in front of you is the moment you have handed someone the keys to everything you have built. Here is the third lesson, and this one is the hardest. The walls we build to survive our losses eventually become the walls that trap us. Marcus closed every door after Diana disappeared. He built his empire on top of that grief. And for 15 years, he could not see that the foundation of everything he had created was also the thing that was slowly suffocating him. You do not have to be running a criminal organization to recognize that pattern. Most of us have a closed door somewhere. Something we stopped looking at because looking at it was too painful. And most of us have someone in our lives who benefits from that door staying closed, someone whose influence over us depends on us not asking certain questions. The question this story asks is simple. What are you not looking at? And who is standing next to the thing you are not looking at, making sure the light never quite reaches it? Real strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is knowing who is in the room when you are vulnerable, and having the wisdom to ask every now and then why they are still there. That is the lesson Marcus Vail learned at 48 with a trembling hand and a letter to Oregon, and a woman who had pulled 16 bullets out of him without asking for anything in return. It is never too late to ask the right questions, but it is always better to ask them before the cost of not asking becomes something you cannot pay back.